Okay, good day, everybody. This is the third quarter labor law update for LABCA for our clients and concerned partners. This will be recorded, so if you would like to switch off your cameras, you're more than welcome to do so. You can also then ask a copy from our office for later use of the recording. Now, this is a free webinar. And the purpose thereof is for our clients, and thank you, I can see many of them online, to be able to make informed decisions within your company. Even though we are available and you are our clients, it is difficult to make calls if you're not up to date with what is going on. Now, 2020 has been an interesting year, understatement. And a lot of what has happened was not anticipated by our Labor Relations Act. And there has been no big amendments in the Labor Relations Act or the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. We are using the old tools provided in those two acts to deal with the current circumstances. In future years, people might not know what COVID-19 is and what a lockdown is, but we definitely know what it is and what it feels like. And the purpose is, of course, to advise you in navigating this funny road. These are the topics that we will be covering: TARS, operational requirements, salary requirements and bargaining councils, the Protection of Personal Information Act, and then to golden oldies, but very important basic conditions of employment matters such as hours of work, leave, the national minimum wage, employment contracts, policies, and procedures. Let's start. So TARS is what our government has provided for, and what they did is that it's a temporary employers relief scheme. And in terms of that, if you are a UIF, a Unemployment Insurance Act contributor, you could claim UIF on behalf of your employees that lost out on hours of work due to the lockdown on the various levels. We've had great success in dealing with TARS claims, and there are some of the figures for some of our branches. An interesting note is that the UIF, if you look at this page, it has been extended to the 15th of October 2020. And that means that if there are any TARS claims, if you perhaps failed to do so or didn't see the reason for participating in this and you now do, or if you're in those industries that are still negatively affected, I'm specifically thinking of our hospitality industry areas, you can and may still claim TARS up until the last day. I don't know if they might be extending it further. It is a possibility. So TARS frustrations. The first one was the error codes. The reason why so many error codes, sorry, just see somebody, yes, why so many error codes came up was, if you followed the process, they started this with Excel spreadsheets. And what we have found is that if you are using older payroll systems that do not automatically, some say they do, but that does not mean that they really do. If they do not automatically and correctly talk to the U-filing system, you get many of these error codes. So error codes we've managed to sort out whilst sorting out payroll and also getting the details there correctly. But error codes is most definitely the most difficult to deal with, and that is the frustration from the employer side. Our team has found that it is easier to log on to the TARS system late at night or early in the morning. Thank you guys for going through all that trouble, because during daylight hours when all other HR managers and payrolls are working, the system sometimes just absolutely shuts down So we've moved our time frames and we've worked flexi time to resolve this problem. That is also then the system malfunction is sometimes it just bombs out. And every time there is a update, and I must say the updates aren't bad, but every time there's a system upgrade or a new policy or procedure, then the system, of course, is shut down for a few days. What has creeped in, I don't know how, is duplicate payments. We therefore find companies, specifically construction and civil engineering, that were allowed to reopen on level even 3, that they did claim for March, did claim for April, did claim for a part of May, but then they started working. I don't know how, and we are definitely not responsible for that. And it's not only us, but a payment came through for either June or for July for the full amount, even though the employees worked. So these were erroneous payments that were made from the UIF offices, and they've got some serious unintended consequences that I'll be dealing with now. So part of the duplicate payments would be then the repayment. You would be expected to repay that money. You can't hold on to it. You don't want to be seen with government money. There are enough people out there that defrauded UIF, and you do not want to be part of that investigation. If you've got any queries on how to repay, and they're not making it easy, let's be honest, and you can't just add it to your normal UIF payment, because then things will just go out of whack. So you need to repay them, and they are not actually dealing with the repayments that well, them being UIF. Something that has happened that is bizarre is that we are picking up strikes, many strikes, due to TERS. So what happens is these duplicate payments or extra payments that are being made to companies, employees see this because they can, and as they should, log onto the system and say that there is TERS monies paid to them, but that money is held with the employer. So now we get strikes, and too many of them, where employees say, UIF made payment from TERS on my behalf. You are holding on to my money. I want my payment. And we are striking because you're withholding my money. Our response is that we've either already repaid that money back to UIF, but it is stuck in their system, or that you are not entitled to that money and we are still sorting out how to repay that matter. We've recently had a disciplinary hearing where all of the employees on a specific site started to strike. It's unprotected, first ultimatum, second ultimatum, notice of a disciplinary hearing, and their response at the disciplinary hearing was, we know that we are not entitled to the money because we did work and we were paid for those hours worked. But everybody is stealing from UIF. Why can't we? And they are keeping with the strike, so we did dismiss them. And unfortunately, that was not an isolated incident. If we then proceed to retrenchments. Now, retrenchment, interesting enough, the word retrenchment is never used in the Labour Relations Act. It's operational requirements. So operational requirements can mean quite a few things, but mostly it does mean retrenchment, where I need to reduce staff to remain afloat, or where I've mechanized or automated certain functions or simply outsourced certain functions in order to save costs and to attain some form of efficiency. So an operational requirement is the correct mechanism to use. Now, besides retrenchments, which we are unfortunately doing a lot of, what mechanism do you use? Let's say you did reduce the salary for employees during the lockdown period, specifically more like senior management for whom TERS would make almost no difference in their payment, and you reduce their salaries with 25%. We're now level 1, perhaps level 0 going forward, but how do I deal with those employees that I cannot now put back on their normal salary? What mechanism do I use? And the answer to that would be an operational requirement. That would be an alternative to a retrenchment where I would inform my employees. I'll get to that in a moment. So retrenchments on the softer side, which is still not great, but on the softer side, it'll be the lateral movement of employees from the department. It'll be the permanent salary reductions where you might have realized that there's absolutely no hope. I'm just going to mute everybody. Just give me a second. Thank you. That there is no hope that we would immediately return back to a cash flow positive situation, and therefore I need to reduce salaries either permanently going forward or for a serious period of time, and that is what you'll use an operational requirement mechanism for. You can also move people from temporary to permanent positions and even permanent to temporary positions. Please remember, this is a highly structured environment and that you need to comply with all the procedural requirements when it comes to retrenchments. Something that we are picking up, and I think is very important to look at, would be what is deemed as an unreasonable refusal. Now, in the Code of Good Practice on Operational Requirements, one of the schedules to the Labour Relations Act, there is a section 11, and I'm going to read it. If an employee either accepted or unreasonably refused to accept an offer of alternative employment, the employee's statutory right to severance pay is forfeit. And then the test there would be the reasonableness is determined by consideration of the offer, the reasonableness of the refusal, and a further test. You can see that there are no distinct formulas contained herein, so you would have to look at current case law to see what would be a reasonable refusal and what would be an unreasonable refusal. From my perspective, if it is a salary reduction and including benefits of less than 15%, an employee would have a hard time explaining his or her reasonableness in making such a refusal. So you can reduce benefits, you can reduce salary, and the employer has, well hidden, but also has this possibility if employees unreasonably refuse that you may proceed with a retrenchment at a zero penalty in terms of severance pay. I can see the questions stacking up. I assure you we will have an opportunity to address those questions a little bit later. Please, for those that you'd like to, you can just go into the chat bar and leave your questions there. I will be returning there. Salary negotiations and bargaining councils. Now, first thing is that some unions actually wrote us letters stating that we understand the current economic circumstances and we will not be seeking a salary increase. They are in the minority. Employees and the trade unions do not share the same cash flow positive and or capitalist views in regards to profit, and therefore they are not interested. It is a normal year and normal business, and therefore normal increases should flow. It is therefore a very emotional and very complicated, but salary negotiations do not automatically fall away just because the country and or a specific company or industry is in dire straits. So we'd have to deal with that. Bargaining councils, if you do belong to a bargaining council, the good part is that you can't have strikes. It'll be a big industry strike, but the bad part thereof would be that you might find yourself in a multi-year agreement, and that would usually be CPIX plus something, which would mean that you have no option but to make payment in line with that main agreement. We have received, specifically for those people in the Motor Industrial Bargaining Council, their main agreement has not yet been promulgated, which means that even though unions would be making demands, until, if ever, it is promulgated, the Motor Industrial Bargaining Council main agreement is not yet in place. Once it does come into place and you granted a lesser increase than the promulgated one, you'd have to do a bit of catch up in regards to increases. But for the moment, you wouldn't be wrong in waiting for the main agreement to be promulgated. So what does a multi-year agreement feel like? I've explained in a bargaining council. It's been decided long since, and we find ourselves, for better or for worse, in a multi-year agreement. A plant level negotiations, that would be where there is no bargaining council and you therefore have to negotiate with unions or employees directly at your plant, and that is what is called plant level. And even government has a multi-year agreement. Now, what do you do if you find yourself in a multi-year agreement? Now, what government has done is simply said that I cannot fulfill my duties and I will therefore not be making the increases as per that main agreement. And that's what they've done. So what would be the consequences if you were to do so? It'll depend on the facts, but you can't claim vis maior in circumstances, and employees wouldn't understand what that would mean. So you'd have to negotiate and or talk your way out of that. Plant level negotiations, they will be proceeding. You will get demands from your union, and it might be the usual demands, and you'd have to deal with them. Bargaining councils do have exemption applications, and this would be the opportune moment. You can't apply for exemption to, let's say, a provident fund or an increase or a bonus in December when you realize that you don't have money to make payments. You've got to make those exemptions now. We've contacted all the major bargaining councils and some of the minor ones to get in place all the correct documentation on how they should be done. It is a formal procedure. It does require some financial input and explanation from your company, and it is, again, as I said, a formal process. But our advice to our clients would be, don't wait. Get in your application as soon as possible for exemption. If you'd like more details on this, please give us a call. POPI, Protection of Personal Information Act. As if it is not difficult enough to deal with or to run a business, we now also have this. And as employers, why on a labor seminar would you be dealing with the Protection of Personal Information Act? Because we collect personal information, the information. You will have the employee's ID number, their home address, their cell phone number. If you've got a provident fund, most probably even their kids' ID numbers. So every employer squarely falls within the definition of protection of personal information. I'm not going to read all of this, but the good part of this would be to make sure that you have systems in place so that an unscrupulous person wouldn't get access to your electronic and or hard copy data and then sell it off either for identity theft or for unsolicited electronic communications and or telephone conversations. So I think none of us would mind not getting harassed on the telephone, and going forward, you'd be able to ask them, where did you get my number? And please remove me from your system. And if they don't, you would have a POPI claim. The inverse is also true. An ex-employee or a person that applied for a job many moons ago, or even a tender in which you participated, they could be writing you a letter saying that I want you to purge me off your system, and you must have systems in place to manage that. The penalties, and I think the test case would be that company that just got hacked and had 25, I believe, million people's details released to a third party. So the penalties are serious. They are 10 million rands or 10 years in prison. Now, if you look at the 10 years imprisonment, and I can assure you that they will be going after a natural person. You can't send a PTY Limited to jail. You can only send CEOs or managing directors to jail, which means that these penalties and these fines are focused on a natural person within your organization. And in order to avoid any serious challenges, such people need to take the necessary steps to ensure that we can handle it. So for less serious offenses, you can also go to the jail for a period of 12 months. To fail to comply would have some serious consequences, and we'll quickly deal with that. So who must comply? Well, guys, I've prepared a slide here, and it is, there we go. So what businesses operations fall under the POPI Act? Give one back. And so client record services, operations, access. I mean, the list just goes absolutely on and on and on and on. So learning, educational, personal information and employees, special personal information and employees. So it'll be your client records, your operations. I just want to see if I can get this one to run. Sorry. Oh, there we go. Client records, corporate governance, finance and administration, secretarial services, operations, even your access control, and then definitely employers. So it's basically everybody. We have a sister company that specializes in this. So if you've got any questions and practical solutions on how to manage the POPI Act, please give us a call, either from Labco side or then our sister company, HRBot. Okay, we've got hours of work, and I'm going to just share and just look for Mr. Herman Mabelebele, who will be dealing with us on this platform. Okay. There we go. Okay. Good day, Herman. How are you doing?
I'm all right. And how are you, Mr. Pienaar?
So what we need to do is just to address the basics of normal working hours. I'll be referring back to you. Just say that these slides are, of course, the PowerPoint presentation. We do have a complete set of slides that would include any of the information that we are currently dealing with. So hours of work, they have not yet amended the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, so it's still 45 hours per week. If you are working less than that, and I wouldn't suggest that you change it, but just be reminded of the fact that you wouldn't do anything wrong by moving to a 45-hour working week. That means that if it's a 5-day working week, it's 10 hours per day, and if it is 9 hours that you work, if you work 5 days a week, you can be there for 10 hours. Remember, 1 hour is lunch. And if you work 6 days a week, you can work for 45 hours. So one of the interesting and lesser known facts is that there is a earnings threshold. An earnings threshold, and there's one in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act and one in the Company or the Tax Act. I'm not referring to tax, I'm talking about the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. So a person earning 205K per year, and you can just Google earnings threshold. It was last adjusted in September of last year. A person earning above that is exempt. That means that they do not get overtime. As long as you pay more than the earnings threshold, they do not get normal overtime. People below that get automatic overtime. You can't talk or negotiate your way out of that, but people earning above. So there are definitely two categories, and you need to decide what category there would be. If you take your normal salary and your overtime in your specific industry, you might find it a bit more profitable to increase those employees' wages to make sure that they fall above the earnings threshold and not have to pay overtime on a weekly or daily basis. Meal intervals, and guys are funny, there's no such thing as a smoke break or anything. There is only a meal interval, and a meal interval is an hour. By written agreement, it can be reduced to 30 minutes, but there's no extra breaks in between. I'm going to ask Herman just to address us quickly on what we call an averaging of working hours. Herman, if you wouldn't mind. Sorry, yeah, you're unmuted. Go for it.
All right. No, thank you, Mr. Pinar, and Goeiemorgen allemaal, to those who are listening. I hope you are having a fantastic and lekker day. Thank you, Mr. Pinar, for that intro. The Basic Conditions of Employment Act basically allows for flexibility in working hours, but it has to be by agreement between the parties. It can be by individual agreement or through a collective agreement. So what I mean by that is that employees can work up to 12 hours of normal work on any day without receiving overtime. But the BCEA, as it is the ultimate statute, still requires the employees to work for the normal 45 hours per week and may not work on more than 5 days in a week. So what do I mean by that? How do you circumvent that? You will basically circumvent that by making sure that in the 5 days period that the employees are supposed to work, you can reduce the number of days so that you comply with the 45 hours as directed in the BCEA. I think that's it in a nutshell. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Herman is between court cases who we are litigating.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Herman.
Yeah.
I'll refer back to you again. So compressed working week, averaging of working hours, these are tools that are given to us that we can manage. If you look at industries, and I'm just thinking of the poor wine farmers or seasonal goods, that's exactly what you would utilize to make sure that you get your workforce up and done, get the work done correctly. If we then go to leave, if a person is not at work, there must be a very good reason for it. And these are the only reasons why they are not at work but still getting paid. And that would be annual leave, family responsibility, sick leave, maternity, and now paternity leave. Now, annual leave, the minimum is 15 working days. Interesting fact, for those of you that may have domestics, it also carries a smaller formula. It goes 1 day's leave for every 17 days worked, or 1 hour's leave for every 17 hours worked. So if I have a domestic at work and she's coming in 3 days per week for 3 hours on each day, I have to count the hours that she has worked and then work that back from payroll to get my 1/17, and she would be entitled to annual leave. I always find it a bit funny because you can't take a quarter day's leave, but when an employee leaves and you have to pay out, we always pay out the quarters, but you can't really do that. So I just find that a bit ironic. Just remember, if you build up leave and they do retire, they do get dismissed or even retrenched, you will be buying back, or rather paying out, the leave at today's salary. So that leave day, that single leave day that's been coming and dragging along since 2000, will cost you today's salary. Can an employee forfeit leave pay? It is not a simple answer to that, but if I'm entitled to 20, let's say I'm a senior employee, I'm entitled to 20 working days, but I'm so senior that I do not have the opportunity to take my leave, and I just continue working because when I get back, I've got too much work to catch up on. And now you start building up leave credits and serious leave credits. Can I forfeit those leave credits? Can the employer just say, from today on, whatever leave you did not take, you will forfeit? Under certain circumstances, it would be possible, but your paperwork would have to be correct from the employer's side. I'm going to hand back to Herman now just to tell us a little bit about family responsibility leave. Thank you, Herman. Unmute.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Pienaar, and to the participants. Family responsibility leave is governed by the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, in particular Section 27 of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. It entitles employees who have worked longer than 4 months, and or at least who work 4 days in a week to family responsibility leave. But the family responsibility leave can only be granted under certain circumstances, when an employee's child is born or when the employee's child is sick. And then in the event of death of the employee's spouse or life partner, parent, adoptive parent, grandparent, or a child, adopted child, grandchild, or siblings. And it also gives the employer some leeway to require reasonable proof of the illness of the family member or the child or close relative, in the event that the employee requires family responsibility leave. So the provisions of family responsibility leave do not apply for workers who work less than 24 months for their employer.
Thank you, Herman. So it's actually not, it's less than 24 hours in a week that they work. But so there are certain limits on that. If we then go to sick leave also, and like a credit card, some employees do believe this not to be a limit, but to be a target. So some employees would like to meet and use up their sick leave, which they will forfeit. So it goes in a 3-week cycle, 3-year cycle. And it is the same amount of days that you would have worked in a 6-week cycle. Very complicated formula. Basically, it comes down to 30 days sick leave in a 3-year cycle. So it is rather important, kind of also with TERS, that your payroll must keep up with what is going on. It's very difficult if you have running a manual system, but the anniversary dates of when an employee is crossing over into a next 3-year sick leave cycle is rather important. From our perspective, and we've got a whole module on this, if a person has used up 60% of his or her sick leave in a particular cycle, I would suggest that you start a process, not necessarily a dismissal or anything, but just call the employee in and say, please explain to me how you got to 60%, regardless of whether you accepted the doctor's letters or not, and explain to them what the consequences would be going forward. You'll then, of course, have to remind them when their anniversary date would be, but just to manage that problem, because they might not realize that if they get really sick, they would not have sick leave. So that would be sick leave, something to be managed. Maternity leave is paid by the Basic Conditions of Employment Act and then UIF. So it's 4 months and paid by UIF. We've run into some serious problems in this regard. Employers that want to be nice and that make an extra contribution to the employees while they are earning maternity leave from UIF. We have found UIF to sue those mothers that got both UIF and anything from the employer. So it's either or. And UIF simply states they do not look at the figures or how much you got. They just say it's either UIF or what the employer pays you. It cannot be both. So please be careful how you assist your employees. You don't want to cause any unnecessary trouble or harm, but please be careful of that one. Paternity leave, brand new one. So that would be 10 days paternity leave to the father. Of course, he would have to produce and show that he was indeed, or still is, the father. And he would be entitled to 60% through UIF of his salary. I anticipated whole-scale abuse of this. I've not yet seen it, but that would be father's or then life partner's paternity leave. National minimum wage, so that increases every year. Like with the increases, it does not matter what your economy or the company's economy is like. If you do not keep up with the national minimum wage and you did not apply for an exemption, this never goes away. I've found many, many instances where employees come to construction sites, beg for a job. You tell them, I cannot onboard you. And they say, listen, anything, I'll work for 10 Rand, 15 Rand, whatever, as long as I get a job. I promise you, once you've dismissed them or once you've employed them, there will be a claim saying that I've gone to the Department of Labor, so I did work for 3 months or 6 months at that lesser rate. I now demand from you the difference. And there is zero defense in that regard. You cannot contractually work your way around the national minimum wage. So even if you have waiters that work on shifts or schedules, you must ensure that at the end of the day, whatever payment they do receive, that you calculate it as an hourly rate and make sure that you pay above that rate. What happens to work that is done in bulk? So I pay you per meter of production, or I pay you for so many bales packed, or I pay you for so many pallets of bricks stacked. How do you manage that? Exactly the same way. You would have to work out what the minimum production standard is, work it back through the hours, and make sure that your equation ends up at more than 20 Rand 67 per hour. You cannot pay on production alone. If you do, make sure that it balances out and that you keep those calculations, because as I said, these claims never fall away. It increases yearly, and it's part of the the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. National minimum wage, an absolute landmark. You can't move around this one. Contracts of employment. I'm quickly going to hand back to Herman and just ask him for a brief explanation of what the difference would be between a fixed term contract and a permanent contract. Thank you, Herman.
Thank you, Mr. Pienaar. So the difference between a fixed term contract and a permanent contract of employment is that the fixed term contract is has an expiry date, it has a start date and an end date, and it also terminates by a fraction of time. And then with a permanent contract, it's indefinite, but it terminates at retirement age, as will be agreed, normal retirement age, as will be agreed by the employer and employee as to what the retirement age will be.
Thank you, Herman. We've picked up SAA, when they still existed, for saving costs, just unilaterally reduced the retirement age. And they got absolutely hammered in every court that they went to. So please remember, if you've got a retirement age in your contract of employment and you want to reduce that or increase that, you need an employee's written consent. Older companies actually have a problem. We've found that older contracts do not carry a retirement age. That would mean they can work until death do us part. You actually have to go through your contracts of employment and see who falls into that category and make sure that you set in place written agreements in regards to the retirement age. Just on permanent contracts. There is a section 200A in the Labour Relations Act, and it's the first caption here, presumption as to who is an employee. Now the default setting for the Labour Relations Act is that everybody is an employee. So for a person to not be an employee, but to be a subcontractor is actually an exception and not the rule. So the wording of the Act is actually very broad. It says that regardless of the form of contract, a person who renders services to or works for a company is considered to be an employee. And then there are certain categories. So you can't contractually work your way out of this. You have to make sure that you carry a distinct difference between employees and subcontractors. They can coexist, but please make sure that you deal with this matter and get in some expert advice, because Section 200A comes at you like a freight train. And we've found so many clients that we could not assist because they did not have the correct contracts in place, or that they were masquerading subcontractors that were indeed employees if you apply the test. So fixed term contracts is either contract based. So we've got a big bulky contract. We are building a building for a government institution, and you know that contract will last you 3 or 4 years. You can actually put on fixed term contracts for that project. It can also be time-based from now until December. We need lots of workers, or for the December period, you need lots of workers, and that would be a time-based contract. Permanent contracts we've touched on, you must have a retirement age. Please look out for that one. Probation periods most definitely exist. I'm again quoting from the Act. It says, the reasons less compelling may be taken into account for a dismissal during a probation period. So you may build in a probation period. The higher the skill level, the easier to measure a probation level, and the lower the skill level, the more difficult. So construction companies, very difficult to carry that distinction, but in the finance department, actually very easy to carry that distinction. So probation periods must be in writing. Interesting fact is that if you have a dismissal for a probation, you can't object to a con-op process. So a probation automatically, regardless of whether you wanted to split the processes, proceeds to an arbitration. So what happens if I miss my probation period? And I can't tell you how many times this has happened. The employer forgets about the probation period the day or a week after the probation period has lapsed. They come to us and say, listen, we've just now found out that they are absolutely useless and they can't do the job. And we go, sorry, your probation period has rolled over into a permanent contract. It's now the full poor performance route that you need to follow. So reminders, payroll, again, such an important tool. Restraints of trade. Again, people find it very difficult to understand that you can restrict an employee and actually move them out of their line of business because they signed a restraint of trade. And the answer is yes. For that period that you entered into the restraint of trade, you may, for that geographical area and for that time allocated, you'd have to find another industry to work in or to move to a different province or a different geographical area if you want to exercise that. It is also the reason why restraint of trades only has jurisdiction in the High Court, because it is a very touchy subject and it affects a person's freedom of trade and then therefore their status, so therefore the High Court application. So they are quite expensive to enforce, but they most definitely exist. Policies and procedures. I am a minimalist. So I find that employers many times paint themselves in a corner. They've got so many policies that they need to make sure that they are on the correct side of. So I wouldn't overindulge in policies and procedures, but policies that I would look at would be a leave policy, perhaps stating that you cannot ever complete a leave schedule backdate. You can't miss a day's work and then come in and then backdate your Babalas day, right? So you can't do that. You've got to apply beforehand. So a leave policy, that would be one. A substance abuse policy, rather important. Polygraph tests, that employees that perhaps do not carry a compulsory polygraph in their contract of employment, that you get a polygraph policy. Smoking, where may and may we not. An email or social media policy. What may I post on social media or on the internet in relation to my employer? Something to consider. PPE policy, what happens? Health and safety will also sort you out here, but how, if I lose my boots or sell my boots or lose my hard hat, what happens? Who replaces what? So those would be policies and procedures. So you use policies and procedures to close loopholes that you've found. Okay, so we're almost at the end of this webinar and we'll be then proceeding to questions. So our next webinar will be with Evan Turk, and he is a specialist in health and safety, and we find it a lot. Yes, we are on level 1, but am I on the right side of the law? What should I or should I not do in regards to COVID and access? And should I take absolutely everybody's temperature? What are the rules to make sure that I do not get shut down or find myself on the wrong side of the law? So that's for peace of mind on how to deal with health and safety issues. That's our Gauteng team that will be looking after you. And we're still having our photo shoot for our Cape Town branch, and we hope to have them on here as soon as possible. Let's just go to some of the questions. Okay. I see from Cape Town, we ask, how far back can an employee claim TERS? If, for example, the employee that was asked to go on leave. We have found it a lot that, technically speaking, employees could not go on leave during the lockdown. I mean, you couldn't go anywhere. So employers that forced their employees to go on leave may have a challenge, if properly challenged, to say that I couldn't go on leave. You decided to put me on leave, and I'm not accepting that. You could have taxed me, and that would be the only entitlement, would be my tax money. If an employee then wanted to get his tax money and you did pay out some leave to them, it would be a possibility, but the default setting would be that you almost impossible to have taken leave during the shutdown period. So a bit of a loaded question there, but how far back can an employee claim TERS? The answer to that would be yes, there were certain hard shutdown periods. I think it would be very difficult to make a claim now for March. So they do have specific shutdown periods, but I do know that May, June, July, August, all up in the air. You can definitely still backdate them. Minimum wage is not 20 Rand 76, but 20.67. Thank you, quite right. So we've done that. I'm going to open the floor to any questions that you may have. And I'm specifically going to ask my good friend Ari, if you specifically have any question that you'd like to raise with us, please. So you just unmute yourself and then ask your question.
Ludovic, thanks for the opportunity. I got a question. If you got a foreigner, say Zimbabwe, working for you, and do you need to pay UIF? Surely you have to look if the person got a contract or permit to work. Do you pay UIF for foreigners?
Okay. Ari, a very interesting question. So one of the things that a UIF did is they actually did not pay out any foreigners for their tax money. It's one of the bottlenecks. So they took the UIF money for foreigners but wouldn't pay out the tax money. I find that spectacularly unfair. But if you have a foreigner working for you, you must have a contract. You furthermore must make sure that that employee has a valid working permit. If you do not have a valid working permit, if they do not have a valid working permit, the manager of the site will accompany in the same van for the police the employee that was illegally employed. They will both be in trouble. So you must make sure that you have valid working permits and that you, police would be the wrong word, but that you scrutinize those work permits to make sure that they are still valid. What we have found as a practical solution is that, because the irony is that it can be an unfair dismissal if you fire someone for not having a work permit. So the crime that is to employ a person without a permit can still become a CCMA case. So how do you deal with that? We usually tell the employees that we give them instruction to update their working permits, and if they do not return with a valid work permit, it becomes a misconduct matter. So that's the mechanism that we use. But yes, you are supposed to deduct UIF and pay it over on behalf of foreigners. They are not entitled to the benefits, but they are entitled, well, they are obligated to make payment. I see another question here on the chat line. If I want to now implement a retirement policy, whilst I have persons older than 65 in employment, how do I do this? delicately. So you would have to sit down your employees and negotiate with them. There is in South Africa, there is no retirement age. Yes, on 65, most provident funds would refuse to take further contributions. Yes, at 60 or at 65, you would be entitled to UIF payments in regards to your SASSA money, but none of that relates or pulls through to the Labor Relations Act or the contract. So you must have that in writing, and you'd have to negotiate your way out of this. The Department of Home Affairs refused to remotely validate work permits and asylum papers. They must insist that the person reports there in person. I'm not disputing that. Our Home Affairs is not making it easy at all for work permits, and it is a challenge. Any other questions from the open group? Okay, I see that we are perfectly within time. I thank you for being with us. As I've said, I'm just going back to our slide. So we've got our second seminar for our clients and interested parties on the 22nd of September in regards to health and safety. And then later in this year, we will be having our probably second to last webinar, and that'll be misconduct, ill health, retrenchment. So that'll be the law of dismissal, how to manage the law of dismissal. Thank you very much. I'll hand over the recording to the office, and if anybody would be interested, you can have a look. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you, Herman.